come to the stage where we're going to have presentations. Do we have any volunteers to go first? Yes? Perfect.
C'est bon, je peux y aller? Bonjour, bonjour à tous. Alors, pour notre groupe, on a identifié essentiellement deux problèmes principaux. Il y a un problème, le premier problème, c'est le spectre des fréquences. Et le deuxième problème, c'est un problème de contenu. Alors, pour le spectre des fréquences, nous constatons qu'il y a un problème de planification et de gestion et un problème de limitation de cette ressource très importante. Nous avons aussi identifié le fait que les opérateurs, dans leur gestion du spectre qu'ils auraient alloué, ne l'adaptent pas et ne l'optimisent pas en fonction de la couverture réseau qu'ils planifient et qu'ils mettent en œuvre. Alors, pour la partie contenu, nous avons décliné le problème avec ces sous-points adjacents, l'offre et la demande. Alors, pour la partie offre, nous avons identifié les difficultés au niveau du politique, qui peut limiter la diversité du contenu offert. Et nous avons aussi identifié la difficulté de localiser le contenu pour qu'il soit accessible, par exemple, en langue locale auprès des différentes populations. Pour en venir maintenant aux solutions. Donc, au deuxième point, les solutions que nous avons, sur lesquelles nous avons réfléchi. Alors, pour le spectre des fréquences, il est clair que la solution consiste à, d'abord avec le régulateur, de le former et de le préparer pour qu'il puisse gérer au mieux et planifier au mieux le spectre de fréquences et en même temps sensibiliser les opérateurs dans leur plan de couverture réseau. Pour la partie contenu, donc au niveau de la demande, nous avons comme solution à offrir au fait que les gens n'accèdent pas, soit par ignorance ou soit par difficulté de langue. Nous offrons le fait d'abord qu'on puisse faire un effort de localisation du contenu. Un deuxième point, c'est les former et les informer. Et puis aussi simplifier l'accès à ce contenu avec des technologies et des outils qui sont très facilement accessibles. Pour la partie offre, nous voulons encourager les initiatives qui sont prises dans différents pays par le gouvernement dans les différents pays africains pour que le gouvernement offre plus de services qui intéressent l'ensemble des populations, que ce soit des services de santé, des services d'accès à tout ce qui est documents administratifs, procédures administratives, et ainsi de suite. Nous voulons aussi encourager le business, le côté business, à aller de plus en plus vers des services online. Et donc, pour le dernier point, qu'est-ce que nous voulons faire dans l'immédiat? Pour la partie spectre de fréquence, il est clair que notre objectif est de former le plus rapidement possible et demander aux régulateurs de s'équiper pour mieux gérer et optimiser le spectre de fréquence. Pour la partie contenu, Alors, c'est aussi, les objectifs sont un peu plus, je dirais, ambitieux. Donc, on propose que d'abord que les startups, donc l'écosystème startup, petites et moyennes entreprises, puissent être encouragés à offrir de plus en plus de contenu qui intéresse les internautes de chaque pays, et aussi mettre à l'œuvre les chercheurs, les universitaires, pour qu'ils puissent apporter des solutions et offrir aussi, donner leur contribution en contenu. Il est aussi important pour résoudre le problème de formation et d'information. Nous avons dit qu'il faut continuer, donc nous fixons comme objectif de continuer l'action de sensibilisation et de formation des différentes populations pour les inclure numériquement et leur permettre un accès continu et important au net et au contenu qui est offert via le net. Voilà. C'est bon? Merci.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm gonna ask the other groups to comment on this these issues that they've identified and some of the solutions. I had one question to the group before we get into that. In terms of the spectrum allocation, is the problem that it's the regulator not opening up the spectrum, or is it that the ISP, for example, is not utilizing the full range of spectra that is available? So it's the ISP not making full use of it. Okay. Comments from the other groups? Yes.
Thank you very much, Said, for the beautiful presentation. I just wanted to ask around some of the propositions that you have made, because our feeling in the group was that we're making propositions that like we can actually start to pick on, like moving from like the idea stage to actually thinking about what can be feasible. So I just wanted to ask from the options that you gave, the extent to which these are within the reach of the particular actor that who you were representing. I don't know whether, like here you're acting as ISOC chapters. Do I get that correct? Yeah. To what extent are the actions that you're proposing within the reach of an ISOC chapter?
La question est très importante. De mon point de vue, parce qu'on n'a pas discuté de ça en détail, mais de mon point de vue, c'est ISOC chapters ont commencé depuis le début. Par exemple, pour MISOC, dans les années 90 et dans les années 2000, nous avons fait, notre plan était essentiellement de la sensibilisation et de la formation. Donc, on allait dans toutes les régions du Maroc pour former à Internet, et sans distinction entre alphabet, analphabète, on ne faisait pas de distinction. Et on travaillait avec les associations locales, c'est-à-dire que lorsqu'on arrive, par exemple, dans une région, on mobilise une association locale, pas ISOC, une association métier, professionnelle, d'habitants, un syndic d'un quartier, pour qu'on arrive à former sur Internet toute population, que ce soit l'âge, sans tenir compte de l'âge ou quoi que ce soit. Donc, mon idée, c'est qu'on continue ça. D'ailleurs, au Maroc, j'ai essayé dernièrement de contacter le ministère qui est en charge des associations pour justement voir comment on peut retravailler ensemble. Nous avons des centaines de milliers d'associations. Si on peut, comment on peut les mobiliser pour mieux former, sensibiliser les différentes populations que elles, ces associations, ont accès directement. Donc voilà un apport possible, c'est faisable, mais bien sûr, ça demande beaucoup d'efforts. Je ne sais pas si vous voulez ajouter.
So it sounds like it's within reach, if I were to summarize. So if we go through some of the questions here, or part of the solutions that were identified, if we start with the spectrum allocation here, and apologies to the translator, but it might have been lost in translation, that you identified a regulator as really important to talk to. But if I understood the problem correctly, the ISPs also had a role here, right? In the sense that they were not utilizing the full benefits that were available to them. So I could see ISPs being up there in the discussions, right? In addition to that, I'm thinking of a stakeholder here, because the issue is perhaps the optimized use of a specific spectra. Who do you need for to make that argument? It could be that certain chapters, certain individuals, or certain members might be in a position to really forward that argument and give a really solid economic as well as technical argument for why they could improve this. But it could also be that you should look out and look, for example, at academia to give them the heads up, hey, we've identified an issue here that is really interesting. I think you guys should have a look at it and help us with the argument here of how it could be improved. So in terms of in the solution sphere, sort of addressing this issue of inefficient spectral allocation, really look out to see what you need in order to achieve that goal. So in this case, it's the optimized use of the available spectra. It could be that the regulator should play a role in informing the ISPs. Could be that the ISPs should take the lead in solving it themselves. So I think it's a really good case. And my question to the rest of the groups are if this is an issue that they've encountered in their countries as well, the issue of spectra. Do we have any more comments? Okay. I'm taking a little bit of notes on the side, but I think that all the groups should also take a little bit of notes in terms of what we're discussing here are real life examples, or it's based on real life examples from the different countries. And when we move forward in the program today, we're going to go to an action plan. So, for example, in this case, we've identified that one of the issues here is the content on the demand side as being an issue. And we've seen a couple of proposed solutions to that. Now, it's without being presumptive, I'm assuming that maybe other groups have a similar issue that they want to address in terms of content. So already there we have common goals for a couple of chapters, perhaps. So that could be an action point that we build on. But it could also be that we've identified, oh, in this case, they had a unique issue that they identified in terms of spectrum allocation, but it kind of sparks interest from the other chapters. So that could also be something. So in terms of looking at the issues, take a little note of what you think could be an interesting thing to collaborate on as we go ahead. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just want to support the issue of the frequency distribution that they talked about, and to give a live example that happened here in Cameroon. Sometimes the companies, because they've been located a number of frequencies that they can use, and sometimes they go to other regions and they start changing the frequencies. So at one point, the regulator who has the power to go around checking. So when that is seen and verified, the regulator charged them a lot of money to pay, and they've been paid. And that one has brought them to be using the critical resources with a lot of efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that also highlights the fact that we have experience and knowledge within the different chapters that can help us solve the different issues. So in my notes, I'm taking down spectrum allocation as an interesting action point to look further into. So do we have a next voluntary group? English speakers?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I didn't hear feedback. Of course, when I speak, I have to wait for the translation. So when I say good afternoon, I look at you, you wait a little bit, and then you smile and say, bonsoir. All right, thank you. In our group, we identified two issues that we found to be most important. This was a synthesis of the real country situations from the members that we had in the group. And these two issues were, number one, the cost or the pricing of accessing internet by the end user. So that was a real concern for at least two of the countries from the members in the group. The second one was poor and uneven distribution of infrastructure. Poor and uneven distribution of infrastructure. So these are the two issues that we then ran with, continuing with the rest of the assignment. For both of the issues, we felt that this was purely supply side. The challenges were emanating from the supply side. We did not see any particular issues of note from the demand side. It was mostly the supply side, and in our discussion, the underlining tone was that this challenge needs to be addressed from the supply side. So we looked slightly at what could be some of the key issues around the exorbitant costs, the unaffordability of the internet by the end user. And the first thing we looked at was unfavorable tax regime on the internet service provider. Now, while we understand that internet service providers are in business, our thinking was not, they were not out to really punish the end user, but their pricing structure was something that was drawing directly from the costs that they also need to take care of. So we're very cognizant of that fact, and we thought that it's an issue if we should take any action to consider. The second thing was heavy capital cost. I'll just give an example from my country, Zimbabwe. One of the ISPs recently spent about 120 million US dollars laying a fiber optic cable. And every time we've had discussions with them, they've cited this as one of the reasons why internet is still very expensive for the end user. They still need to recoup from the heavy capital investment that they have made. We also looked at one of the reasons for high cost is lack of an IXP. I won't go into this. I think Carl spoke a little bit about it, how having an IXP significantly lowers the cost of internet, and particularly for the end user. We also looked at poor regulation in terms of price control. We know that the regulator has power to rein in or bring back ISPs or service providers that might unnecessarily be hiking prices. I'll give again another example from my country where we've had a fair level of control by the regulator in terms of how much they can charge for different services, right? Then lastly, under the issues to consider on price was lack of local content. I think this was discussed by the previous group, how higher access of external content significantly raises the cost of accessing the internet compared to accessing of local content, right? So these are the issues that we felt were important in terms of cost. I'll just quickly run through the issues that are associated with infrastructure. The first one here is poor regulation, which does not support infrastructure in marginalized areas. I think we spoke at length about this yesterday, how ISPs are not very keen on developing infrastructure, particularly areas where access is generally poor and where population density is sometimes do not provide a future. The other issue was poor technical capacity. I'll give one example from my colleague from Gambia, where she was talking about how she feels that they might have the technical, they might have good infrastructure, but they are not completely manipulating the benefits of that available infrastructure. So technical capacity here remained an issue. And then lastly, we looked at political will and investment incentives. So this also connects to the previous points where we realize that one of the reasons why cost might remain high is because, for example, an ISP is very heavily taxed in terms of customs and excise, bringing in equipment, for example. But if they were able to get an incentive, this could also affect the cost for the end user in terms of accessing the internet, at least in the short term. And then maybe just one more, the historical situation of national domain management. I think this was actually quite common in the group, that when you have got your national domains, like for example, in Zimbabwe, you've got the .zw, and then in Uganda, you have the .co.ug, and then in Gambia, we have the .gm. Interestingly enough, I think in all of the countries, we discovered that this was not being managed publicly. It was actually being managed by private entities. And we felt that this was an important issue in terms of addressing the issue to do with infrastructure. Right. So I'll just quickly pick on two of what we thought would be favorable outcomes. I'm being mindful of time. The first one, in terms of cost, favorable tax regime. The second one, putting in place an IXP. The third one, investor incentives, particularly customs duty and excise. And lastly, more local content. That's what we want to see. We just want to see more local content. And then in terms of infrastructure, setting up of a common fund. I think we've been thinking about this since yesterday. Taxing the private players to contribute to a common pool fund that can be used to support building of infrastructure where the private players are not keen on going, and also many of the other things. And we felt in terms of technical capacity, it was also important to support the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics program. I gave an example for our own country. We started this last year, and I think in the countries from the colleagues, they've also started this. And then going on to the last one, what can we do now, right? As Internet Society chapters, we felt that what was within our reach and purview is to do a regional comparison study, particularly in terms of how much it costs to access the internet. This would be very important if we are going to start talking to any actor to show that this is how much it's costing. For example, within the region for Zimbabwe, it would be, say, in South Africa, Botswana, and even cross-regional comparison to say, in Kenya, it costs so much, in Gambia, so much, in Uganda, so much. This is an important starting point. Secondly, mobilize resources and carry out training and awareness. I think Said spoke about this in depth, and I was actually happy to hear that this is something that has been happening for a long time. I think this definitely needs to continue. And also present policy options to responsible government departments, and also share this with the ISPs. Sometimes some of these actors need somewhere to start from. So if we carry out a regional comparison study, we can do some policy options that a basis for us to start talking. And then support with equipment at micro level. I think we had one good example in Gambia, where you can just support with technical equipment as and when it becomes available. You can tap into social responsibility programs of these big players and support the STEM programs that I was talking about. Then maybe just lastly, free access as a public service by these players. I'll give you a good example. In Zimbabwe, if you open your .acs, your university websites, they're free. You don't pay anything. So what this means is that for a student, because we're using the student as a good measure of affordability. If a student can afford it, then it means there's a high chance that everyone else can afford it. So if you're a student and you're in Zimbabwe, all of the university websites are free. This is a public service that I think ISPs can consider. I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think we hopefully maybe triggered a common action item in the regional study. I think that's a really interesting proposal. If I were to add to that, is that you have kind of price comparison studies being done by certain actors. I don't have the numbers in my head, but something that is interesting would be to have a regional study that is really digging into all of the aspects that affects pricing. So, for example, you could have, I don't know, if the ITU is collecting data, they will look specifically just on the cost and then compare it to the GDP per capita, for example. But perhaps there's other factors that are in play here that are impacting the actual affordability that is not visible in those type of statistics. So to really, in that comparison, offer a kind of tweak of what affordability is. But it's a really good idea, and it's certainly something that a organization like ISOC with this network of chapters has a really interesting position to do something. I'm going to invite the other groups with some initial reflections. Anyone have any comments?
Le groupe qui vient de parler, félicitations. Ils ont dit qu'ils ont identifié deux problèmes. Le problème de coût et puis le problème de l'infrastructure pour étendre le service. Je voulais plutôt intervenir sur le premier problème, celui qui est lié au coût. Au lieu d'appeler ça coût, je préfère qu'il parle du problème de prix. Parce qu'il y a une grande différence entre le coût et le prix. Et ce qui intéresse le end user, c'est le problème du prix. Parce que le coût, c'est un problème de l'opérateur. Combien ça coûte à un opérateur pour produire 1 méga, par exemple, de données Internet? Si ça lui coûte $1, alors le prix qu'il doit mettre doit être proche du coût pour qu'on ne soit pas très loin de $1 comme prix de service. Donc, c'est juste pour dire qu'au lieu de parler du coût comme problème, il faut parler donc du prix. Sinon, pour le reste, je suis d'accord. Merci.
Can I? Yeah, I know it's a problem of language, and we looked at it at this standpoint, supply chain. So that's why we're very specific about cost. And we also to note that if the cost is good, then the price would also be good. So we were able to identify that the problem is supply. That's why we look in terms of cost. But you have to understand that once the cost is good, the price will also be good. Thank you.
Yeah. Là, on va rentrer un peu en économie, c'est un peu très compliqué. Les opérateurs ont la mauvaise manière de mettre le prix très loin du coût. Et c'est le rôle du régulateur, de connaître le vrai coût du service pour qu'il soit capable de surveiller quel est le prix et de faire à ce que le prix soit proche, rapproché du coût. Et en régulation, on dit les prix doivent être orientés vers les coûts. Donc, vous ne pouvez pas maîtriser les coûts et le rôle de la personne morale qui doit avoir la maîtrise du coût, c'est le régulateur parce que les opérateurs ont la manière de tromper le régulateur pour dire que le coût est élevé alors que le coût est bas pour justifier le service élevé qu'ils mettent comme prix de service. Et c'est le consommateur qui prend le coût. Donc, c'est très complexe le problème du coût et c'est le rôle du régulateur de faire à ce que les coûts soient proches des coûts réels. Et donc, ce qui peut nous intéresser, ce qui est plus simple, c'est faire à ce que le prix de service soit simple, c'est plus simple à gérer à notre niveau en tant qu'ISOC, au lieu de rentrer dans les coûts qui sont des trucs très, très, très compliqués. Merci.
Thank you, and I'm glad that you brought in economics, because that was actually my follow-up here, because in the scenario that they're depicting, if I understood correctly, they are what you in economics describe as a competitive environment, so that the difference between the cost and the price, the profit that the ISP is extracting is relatively low, and that the costs are due to the unfavorable tax regime. It's due to I can't see what I wrote, but lack of access to technical equipment, for example. So I agree that it's important to see if the costs or the pricing is reasonable in accordance to the cost. At the same time, ISPs are businesses, so they're going to expect a profit, right? So it's about finding that what is reasonable, as you say. Is it the fact that they are able to extract high profits due to a monopoly status because of a lack of competitiveness, etc. And what is interesting in that as well is that many of these issues that we're describing here is something that the ISPs are interested to learn about, because you can also benefit from the fact that they are interested in trying to get profits. So if you can provide them with a business case that if you take the universal fund, for example, I bet that a lot of those cases could be that, let's say that you have a relatively competitive environment, but no one is investing in the rural areas because there's a very high capital cost in the onset to extend the backbone. So there's no kind of first mover advantage of doing it. Then if you create a universal access fund and say that, okay, let's bridge this insecurity problem about this. You will all pool your resources, you will all share the benefits from it, but you're sharing some of the risk. So you're overcoming a barrier for them that will help them to actually become more profitable and at the same time expand the internet access. But I agree that it's also important to have or to request a level of transparency around what are the actual costs and what is kind of illegitimate rent extraction from the user. So it's a good point that economics is inescapable in these questions. Do we have any more comments on this presentation? Yes? Is it on economics?
Ok. Au fait, je voudrais juste appuyer toujours dans le même sens, mais un peu vers les utilisateurs, c'est-à-dire le rôle des utilisateurs dans la diminution des coûts. Par exemple, cette année, chez nous, au Mali, il y a eu un petit phénomène qui s'est passé. Les jeunes ont formé des groupes sur Viber pour essayer de se mobiliser afin de convenir d'un jour où ils vont enlever les puces d'un opérateur sur place de leur téléphone. Tout simplement parce que le coût est exorbitant. Quand tu prends, par exemple, 2000 francs CFA, supposons que tu aies 2000 francs, avec 2000 francs CFA, tu as 100 mégas au Mali, tu vas trouver qu'avec les mêmes 2000 francs CFA, tu as 200 mégas, sinon plus au Sénégal. C'est vrai, le Mali et le Sénégal, c'est pas le même pays, et ils ont la fibre directement. Nous, on prend la fibre à partir de chez eux. Mais cela ne peut pas expliquer, c'est-à-dire la très grande différence qui existe. Donc, les jeunes, ils ont fouillé. Ils ont même fait sortir des statistiques, ils ont balancé sur Facebook, sur plein de réseaux sociaux. Et je crois le 31 décembre, c'était le jour ultime où tout le monde devait enlever la puce de l'opérateur en question de son téléphone. Ça a très bien fonctionné. Ils l'ont fait. Moi, j'ai suivi l'événement en tant qu'ISO. Je me suis mis à côté, j'ai suivi l'événement. Ils ont fait. Ils n'ont pas eu quand même une diminution sur le coût, mais ça a eu un impact. Parce qu'il y avait le coût de l'Internet, il y avait le coût lié, sinon les prix liés au transfert par Orange Money, les transferts d'argent par Orange Money. Et par la suite de cet événement, les prix par rapport au transfert ont connu un peu de modification. Bon, je me dis peut-être si les utilisateurs aussi arrivent à prendre le problème à bras le corps, essayer de voir dans quel canal on peut vraiment jouer, faire pression sur l'opérateur, ça peut vraiment jouer sur la problématique des prix. Merci.
That's a very cool example. It's a good example of consumer power putting into practice, where you can actually, as a group, coordinate using the internet and then affect the IXP or ISP. We had a comment from the back here, please.
Bonjour une fois de plus. Permettez, la mienne, c'est plutôt une préoccupation. Est-ce que est-ce qu'on ne pourrait pas, dans l'aspect de réduire les coûts Internet, amener des gens non seulement à développer des contenus locaux, mais aussi à placer des serveurs qui permettent d'héberger ces contenus localement? C'est vrai que cela fait appel aux problèmes d'énergie, d'eau potable. Bon, bref, je pense, pour moi, c'est que ça serait un impact parfois sensibiliser des gens pour qu'ils puissent développer et investir dans l'hébergement ou bien localement, comme ça, là, en ayant, lorsqu'on va créer le IXP, ils pourront moins cher, ça réduirait, je pense, après d'un centime, après de 100 à de 99% les coûts de connexion Internet.
Thank you. That is a really good example of how you could both benefit the end user. You can increase demand, but you can also improve supply, because if you're able to host the content that is consumed locally, you're also avoiding very expensive transit costs. So, as he was mentioning, let's say that you're having a website with news about Cameroon, and then that website is hosted in Europe. But you weren't interested in the news in Cameroon, right? So they're going to bring home all that data to Cameroon. So why is it hosted in Europe and not in Cameroon? And that's where you have to get in, as you were mentioning, to all the factors that allows a local ecosystem for web hosting. And this is something that ISOC has been studying. We're studying it in the case of Rwanda, and found some really interesting results. I'm happy to share that study with you guys later, because it's a very important point where there is a kind of a solution here that is benefiting both the demand side and the supply side. And with the knowledge, there's a lot of stakeholders that would be interested in having that implemented. And also, I was giving this example last night, but it's very small things that sometimes has to be done. So in the case of Rwanda, for example, we saw that one of the big ISPs had made a huge investment in a server facility to provide web hosting. The problem, they said, was that, okay, we invested in all this new, expensive, beautiful equipment, but everyone is still hosting abroad. because it's cheaper. Now, when we looked at the data that they have, and you compare it to, so for example, if they were to host, if a website, a Rwandan website was to host their website on a European provider, they would pay maybe $100 for unlimited data storage. Now that is very hard to compete with. But in reality, a website only requires maybe 2 gigabytes of storage space. So once you start breaking it down and packaging it to the consumer, suddenly the web hosting in Rwanda became competitive, and it was actually favorable for the website to be hosted in Rwanda. So the point is that sometimes it's really looking at the whole picture in these cases to find where is the little tweak that is needed in order to make it happen. But it's a very good example that you're giving with the importance of local content and creating that environment where it can be hosted locally, because there's a lot of stakeholders that would benefit from that being hosted locally. Sorry, I got off track, but we have another comment here.
Excusez-moi, je vais revenir sur l'économie. Excusez-moi. Par rapport au cas du Mali, pour notre compréhension, je précise pour le frère que vous aviez un problème de prix. Ce que les utilisateurs demandaient, c'est que le prix soit bas. Parce que, entre-temps, vous avez encore dit que c'est un problème de coût. C'est un problème de prix. Le problème de coût, c'est un problème de l'opérateur. Parce que pour revenir sur les utilisateurs, si le coût est élevé et que le prix, vous lui forcez de ramener le prix bas, il va tomber comment on appelle ça, en banqueroute, en faillite. Donc le problème, c'est commencer par les coûts. Est-ce que les coûts sont des coûts réels qui reflètent la réalité? Parfois, le coût est élevé par erreur. Je donne un exemple. Dans un endroit où une seule personne suffisait, on prend 3 personnes. Donc, il faut faire une étude de coût pour dire que cette tâche-là peut être faite par une seule personne. Comme ça, le coût va descendre vers le bas et le prix aussi va, par conséquent, descendre. Donc, c'est un problème de coût et prix. Le prix, c'est ce qui intéresse le consommateur, mais le coût, c'est le problème de l'opérateur, mais le régulateur doit mettre la pression sur les opérateurs pour que le coût puisse baisser de façon à ce que le prix, par conséquent, puisse baisser au bénéfice du consommateur. Merci.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Do we have any final comments on these ones before we go to lunch? We're going to continue with the remaining groups briefly after lunch before we have a discussion on privacy, which I think will be interesting. So if there's no further comments, Victor, where's the lunch? Okay, outside to the right?
Yeah.
Okay, and when should we be back here?
Normally we're supposed to be back here 2:30.
Okay, so lunch in the room next door, back here at 2:30.
Sorry, at 2 p.m.
That's in 40 minutes.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, no, let's say 2:30. Normally it's 2.
Let's say 2:30.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay, thank you all.